Welcome to Whispers in the Dark. What if the man you trusted most harbored the darkest secret? A secret so terrifying it could shatter everything you thought you knew about your family. Imagine discovering your grandfather might be a serial killer and that he's been hiding monstrous creatures. Creatures that could be closer than you ever imagined. Stay with us till the end. You won't believe the shocking truth. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark to support the channel and keep us bringing you more chilling tales. New Orleans is a city brimming with a history soaked in mystery, whispers of the dead, and shadows that seem to move of their own accord. From the eerie, narrow alleyways of the French Quarter to the hushed, darkened corners of its ancient homes, the city is alive with secrets that the living dare not speak of. It was to this very place that Jason found himself drawn after the tragic loss of his parents in a car accident, a city as strange and unsettling as the grief that gripped him. Jason was a young man still reeling from the sudden emptiness of life without his parents. At 26, he had spent most of his life in the quiet suburbs of Connecticut. But now, in the aftermath of the tragedy, he had been forced to leave behind everything familiar. New Orleans, with its haunting allure and foggy, moonlit nights, was now his refuge, and yet there was nothing that could shelter him from the confusion and pain of his loss. The call came one rainy evening when the steady hum of a faraway storm mixed with the sound of the city's endless night. His grandfather, Harold, a man Jason had only seen a handful of times during his childhood, offered a place for him to stay. At first, Jason had hesitated. He didn't know this man well enough to call him family, and even if he did, there was something about the invitation that felt like a last resort. But as the days passed, Jason found himself alone with no real choice, no place else to turn. Grandpa Harold's house stood at the edge of New Orleans, far from the hustle of the city's infamous streets. Tucked away in a corner where few ventured, the mansion was an eerie relic from a forgotten past, an old, dilapidated estate swallowed by time and the overgrown vines of neglect. But there was something about it that drew Jason in, something cold and distant, like the remnants of a dream. The house had always felt like a place where secrets lived, and now it felt like the perfect home for Jason to stumble upon his own. His grandfather was a man Jason could not easily forget. Harold was a doctor, a famous one by all accounts, well respected in his field before the death of his wife, Jason's grandmother. After her passing, however, something inside Harold seemed to snap. The once imposing figure of the man had become more reserved, more distant, as though his mind wandered into places that Jason couldn't follow. Though Jason had little memory of his grandmother, she had died long before he was old enough to form lasting memories. He had heard enough stories to know that she had been a force to be reckoned with. Strong-willed, kind, and fiercely protective of those she loved, she had been the center of their family. Jason's eyes caught glimpses of her in Harold's wistful gaze, the way his grandfather would speak of her in hushed tones, his voice quivering, yet strangely proud. And despite the way Jason had heard his grandfather praise her, there were parts of his stories that never quite added up, as though the truth had become a fragile thing, shattered and scattered in the wind. There were things that didn't quite make sense about Harold, too. Despite being a doctor with a wealth of knowledge and an air of unshakable confidence, Harold seemed to harbor a kind of sadness, one that no amount of time or knowledge could seem to dispel. Jason found it unnerving, yet at the same time, he couldn't help but feel a strange pull to his grandfather, a desire to unravel the mysteries that lay hidden beneath the surface of this man who had once been Jason's only connection to a family he had barely known. Harold's house itself was a mystery, a reflection of the man who had built it. Each room was lined with thick wooden paneling, dark and worn, reflecting an old-fashioned elegance that time had forgotten. The smell of old books and leather hung in the air, mingled with something darker, something that Jason couldn't quite place. The house, like its owner, seemed to live in two worlds at once, one foot planted firmly in the past, the other teetering on the edge of a dangerous, unknown future. Jason moved through the house in silence, the floors creaking beneath his feet as though they, too, were aware of the tension that lingered in the air. His room was at the far end of a long hallway, overlooking the dense thicket of trees that surrounded the property. At night, the wind would pick up, howling through the trees, creating a symphony of whispers that made Jason's skin crawl. The house was alive. He could feel it, the walls pulsing with a presence he couldn't yet comprehend. It was on his second night in the house that Jason's curiosity began to shift into something darker. He had always been aware that his grandfather's life was shrouded in secrecy, but it was on that night, as the house settled into its eerie silence, that Jason began to wonder if his grandfather's past might be far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. It started with the stories. During the days, Jason and Harold would sit at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and talking about trivial matters, life in New Orleans, Jason's parents, and his own adjustment to the new surroundings. But in the quiet moments, Harold's stories grew stranger. They would begin with vague references to old friends and patients, people Harold had once known, and gradually delve into unsettling details. His voice would take on a distant, almost wistful tone as he spoke of events long past, as though he were trying to capture something he had lost. But there were also moments when Harold's words faltered, that made Jason feel like there was something else beneath the surface, something lurking in the darkness of those stories. He would speak of old acquaintances who had mysteriously disappeared, patients who had been admitted to his care but had never been seen again, and tales of unsettling coincidences that he tried, unsuccessfully, to dismiss as mere happenstance. Jason found himself listening with growing unease, sensing that his grandfather was telling him only a fraction of the truth. It was late one evening, after a long day of going through his parents' belongings, that Jason's suspicions began to take root. He had been in the study, sorting through boxes of old photos and letters, when he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. The house, as always, was silent, the only sounds the occasional rustle of wind against the trees. But tonight, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, waiting. He crept to the window, his breath shallow, and peered out into the thick blackness that had swallowed the yard. Through the shadows, he could just make out the silhouette of his grandfather's figure, moving stealthily toward the edge of the property. Jason's heart raced, his mind working overtime to piece together what he was seeing. Harold was acting strangely. He was carrying something, a bundle heavy in his arms. Jason watched as his grandfather disappeared into the woods, the faint rustle of leaves the only sign that he was still there. The questions flooded Jason's mind, too many to count. What was Harold doing in the woods? Who or what was he carrying? And why had he gone out there in the dead of night without a word of explanation? That night, as Jason lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, suffocating him in its mystery. He knew he had to follow Harold the next time he went out, but the thought of what he might uncover kept him frozen in place, terrified of the unknown. Would he find answers, or would he find something far worse? The house seemed to breathe with him, the silence thick with secrets that Jason couldn't yet unravel. And as he lay there in the dark, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist in strange, unnatural ways, as if the house itself was waiting for something, waiting for him to discover what it had been hiding all along. Jason didn't know it yet, but that one fateful night would set in motion a chain of events that would change his life and his understanding of the world forever. Something dark was lurking in the corners of his grandfather's past, something Jason was about to awaken, and when he did, he would never be the same again. Jason's first few weeks in New Orleans felt like the calm before the storm. He spent his days adjusting to the disorienting rhythm of life in his grandfather's home, the old house in the woods on the edge of the city. At first, he tried to convince himself that the strangeness that seemed to permeate the place was just his own mind working overtime, the product of grief and isolation. But as the days passed, he began to notice things that didn't make sense, things that began to weigh on him like an invisible force pressing down on his chest. Harold, his grandfather, was a man of habits, habits that at first seemed harmless. Every morning, he would wake early, donning his old green robe that Jason had come to associate with quiet authority, and make his way downstairs. The smell of coffee filled the house like an old friend, familiar and warm. They would have breakfast together, the silence between them comfortable, but Jason's thoughts were never far from the unease that had slowly settled in his stomach. It wasn't until the nights began to change that Jason truly started to feel the weight of something darker looming over them. The first time it happened, he thought little of it. Harold had always been a man of few words, but now there was a distance in his movements that Jason couldn't ignore. His grandfather would disappear into the darkness of the house late at night, long after Jason had turned in for bed. The house was large and creaky, full of long hallways and shadows that seemed to move even when no one was around. Jason's curiosity began to get the best of him. It was a cold night when Jason first saw it for himself. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows like something eager to get inside, and the rain hammered against the roof. He had just closed the book he'd been reading and was about to slip into bed when he heard the faintest sound, a creak of wood against wood, the kind of sound the house made when Harold moved through it at night. Jason's curiosity piqued. He sat up, listening. It wasn't the normal shuffle of Harold's footsteps on the wooden floors. This was different. There was a sense of purpose in the movement, a quiet urgency that Jason had never heard before. Quietly, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the door. He knew the house like the back of his hand by now, but something about this night felt different. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt the familiar chill of the house seep into his skin. His heart pounded in his chest, a rhythmic echo in the quiet night. Jason moved down the hallway as silently as he could, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His eyes instinctively went to the window, and for a moment he thought he saw something moving in the yard. It was Harold, of course. There could be no other explanation. But why was he out there? Jason had been too tired to ask before, but now he couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Something about the way Harold had moved through the house tonight made Jason uneasy. Stepping cautiously toward the stairs, Jason peered down through the shadows. There was his grandfather, his back turned, moving slowly through the kitchen and out the back door. Jason hesitated for a moment, but then his feet were moving on their own accord, silently following Harold. The night outside was thick with the fog rolling in from the bayou, and the moon hung high, casting an eerie light over everything. Jason watched from the doorway, unsure of what he was seeing, yet unable to pull himself away. Harold was no longer walking toward the shed or the garage as he typically did. Instead, he was heading toward the woods that bordered the property, those thick trees Jason had always tried to avoid, their gnarled branches twisting like claws in the night. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he followed, creeping closer through the underbrush, careful not to make a sound. The dampness of the ground made it harder to move quickly, and his shoes sank into the wet earth with each step. He felt like a trespasser in his own home, like a witness to something that should remain hidden. Through the trees he saw his grandfather stop. Harold's back was to him, but Jason could see him bending down, reaching into the trunk of his old black SUV. What was he doing? The air felt thick with unease as Jason edged closer, his heart hammering in his chest, his breath caught in his throat. Then to his horror, Jason saw it, a body. A woman, her limbs limp and her face pale, her hair tangled in the moonlight. Harold was dragging her across the damp earth with a steady, deliberate motion. Jason's mind spun as he watched, frozen in place, unable to move or breathe. He could hear the sound of his own pulse in his ears, thumping loudly as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The woman's body seemed so lifeless, so unnatural in the way it hung from Harold's grasp. Her face was turned toward Jason now, and the horror that swept through him was beyond anything he had ever experienced. She was not just dead. She had been carefully, almost reverently, placed in a position that seemed to hold some twisted meaning. Jason's legs felt like they were made of stone as he watched, every muscle in his body screaming for him to turn and run. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed by a mix of fear, confusion, and something darker, something that told him he was about to uncover something unspeakable. Harold moved the body with surprising strength, his hands sure and practiced as he carried the woman deeper into the woods. Jason felt his breath catch in his throat as he followed, unable to tear himself away. What was he supposed to do? Call for help? Confront his grandfather? His mind raced through all the possibilities, but each thought was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming need to understand. What was Harold doing with this woman's body? Why was he out here in the dead of night, dragging her through the trees like some forgotten piece of trash? Jason took another step forward, his foot slipping in the mud as he tried to keep his balance. His grandfather turned abruptly, his eyes locking onto Jason's with a look of cold recognition. There was no fear in Harold's eyes, only the kind of look that suggested he knew exactly what was coming. Jason froze, caught in the intensity of the gaze that seemed to see straight through him. Without a word, Harold slowly lifted his hand in a quiet wave, as though acknowledging Jason's presence. The chilling calm in his grandfather's gesture made Jason's blood run cold. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then, before he could even gather his thoughts, Harold turned back toward the trees as though nothing had happened. Jason remained where he was, rooted to the spot by an overwhelming sense of dread. His mind struggled to process what he had just witnessed. The body, the calmness, the way his grandfather had waved as though they were simply going on a walk together, not about to bury a body in the woods. The whole scene felt like a nightmare that Jason couldn't escape. When he finally managed to take a step backward, his foot caught on a branch and he stumbled into the undergrowth, making a loud noise. But Harold didn't turn back. He was already deep into the woods, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. Jason stood there in the dark, his chest tight with fear, his mind spinning. What was happening? What had he just seen? Was his grandfather a murderer? Was he hiding something far darker than Jason could ever imagine? Jason didn't know what to do next, but the chilling realization that he had just stumbled into something far more dangerous than he could handle filled him with an overwhelming sense of terror. The house, the city, and even his grandfather, all of it suddenly felt suffocating, like a trap that was closing in on him. Jason's life was no longer what he thought it was. It was unraveling, thread by thread, and he had no idea what lay beneath. With every passing moment, he knew one thing for sure. His grandfather's secrets were darker than anything Jason had ever been prepared to uncover. The following morning, Jason woke to an oppressive silence that had settled over the house. The events of the night before, the lifeless body of the woman, his grandfather's inexplicable actions, and that chilling wave, hung over him like a dark cloud refusing to dissipate. His mind replayed every detail in a loop, each moment more unsettling than the last. But what he had seen in the woods was only the beginning. There were questions, countless questions that gnawed at him, and he knew that he could not continue to live under the same roof as the man who had shown him such horrors without confronting him. He had to know the truth. Jason paced around his room, his thoughts racing. He couldn't remember a time when he had felt so trapped, so helpless. The house, once a place of refuge, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, seemed to whisper of things Jason had not yet uncovered, things he wasn't sure he wanted to know, but there was no turning back now. The truth was out there, hidden behind the walls of this mansion, lurking in the shadows of his grandfather's secrets. He couldn't let fear paralyze him any longer. He had to ask. He had to confront Harold and demand answers. Jason made his way downstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He found his grandfather in the kitchen, standing by the stove, humming quietly to himself as he made coffee. It was as if nothing had happened. No dead bodies, no hidden truths, no midnight excursions into the woods. Harold's calmness was eerie. Jason stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the back of his grandfather, the familiar sight of him making breakfast somehow only amplifying the growing dread in Jason's gut. Finally, he cleared his throat, and the sound seemed to startle Harold, though he didn't turn around. "Grandpa," Jason said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to talk." Harold slowly turned to face him, a warm but distant smile on his face. "Of course, Jason, you're up early." His voice was calm, almost too calm, as though he didn't notice the tension in Jason's posture, the way he stood at the edge of the room, almost as though he were trying to keep his distance. Jason took a step forward, his mind racing with everything he wanted to say, all the questions he had to ask, but the words were tangled in his throat. Instead, he blurted out the one thing that had been haunting him. "I saw you last night," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I saw what you were doing. I saw you with her. The body. What is going on, Grandpa?" The smile faded from Harold's face, replaced by a look of profound sadness, as if Jason had broken some unspoken rule. Harold stood there for a moment, studying Jason as though he were trying to decide how much to reveal, how much of the truth he could bear to tell. Then slowly he put the spatula down on the counter, wiped his hands on a towel, and motioned for Jason to sit down at the kitchen table. "Sit down, Jason," he said softly, his voice no longer warm but tinged with a quiet authority. "You deserve to know, but this is not easy to explain." Jason sat down, his mind whirling. He hadn't expected his grandfather to act so calm, so collected. But as Harold sat across from him, there was something in the old man's eyes, something distant, something hollow, that told Jason this was no ordinary conversation. Harold took a deep breath, his gaze falling to his hands, which trembled ever so slightly. "You asked me what I was doing last night," Harold began, his voice low. "I suppose I owe you an explanation. The truth is, I've been doing this for a long time, Jason. What you saw, what you witnessed, it's part of something much bigger. It's part of something I've been fighting for decades." Jason's pulse quickened. "Fighting what? What do you mean? You're talking like you're in some kind of war." Harold looked up at him, his eyes weary and older than they had any right to be. "In a way, we are. We've been at war for as long as I can remember, me and, well, others like me. But you don't know them, not yet. I hope you never do." Jason felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Who are you talking about, Grandpa? What do you mean?" Harold's gaze drifted toward the window, his eyes narrowing as if he were searching for something in the distance, something that only he could see. "These creatures, these beings, they are not human, they are something else, something far darker. They've been among us for centuries, Jason. They can take human form, but they aren't human. They feed off our world, our energy, our very essence. And they've been slowly spreading, infecting people, taking over lives. And me, I've made it my life's work to hunt them." Jason felt a chill settle in his chest, as if the temperature of the room had dropped several degrees. He couldn't bring himself to speak, his mind reeling from what he had just heard. Harold wasn't just a man haunted by loss. He was talking about monsters, creatures that weren't supposed to exist. "You're telling me," Jason said slowly, trying to piece it together, "that those people, the ones you've been taking, they weren't people at all, they were, what, some kind of monster?" Harold looked up at him, his face lined with sorrow. "Yes, but it's not as simple as that. These creatures, these outsiders, as I call them, can mimic humans. They don't just look like people, Jason, they become them. They take on their memories, their habits, their thoughts. It's like a possession. They use humans as vessels to carry out their own dark purposes." Jason leaned forward, his heart pounding. "But the woman last night, was she one of them?" Harold nodded slowly. "She was. She had been taken over. I couldn't let her live. Once they've fully taken someone, there's no saving them. They become a shell, a puppet, controlled by the outsider inside them. I've seen it happen too many times, Jason, and I've learned the hard way that the only way to stop them is to take them down before they get too strong, before they hurt more people." Jason's mind was a storm of disbelief and terror. He wanted to scream, to ask his grandfather if he was insane. But the look in Harold's eyes, the quiet sorrow that seemed to weigh down his every word, made Jason hesitate. "What happened to her?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold exhaled sharply, as though the question had cut him deeper than he expected. "I had to end it, Jason. I had no choice. She was gone, completely gone. What was left was just a shell, a monster in human form. I've killed many of them over the years, but that doesn't make it any easier. Every time I do it, I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, but I can't afford to hesitate." Jason's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't comprehend what his grandfather was saying, couldn't reconcile this version of the man with the one he had grown up with, the kind, gentle doctor who had always been there for him. And yet, As he sat across from Harold, he realized that this was the truth, as disturbing as it was. "You said you've been doing this for decades," Jason said, his voice trembling. "How did it start? How did you get involved in all this?" Harold paused for a long moment, his eyes distant again, as though he were seeing something from long ago. "I was a doctor, Jason. A surgeon. I was famous, well respected. I had a good life until Rebecca, your grandmother, was taken from me. It was years ago, but I still remember it like it was yesterday." Jason's heart skipped a beat. What happened to her? Harold's voice dropped to a murmur, the weight of the words heavy. "She was murdered, Jason, not by a drunk driver like I told you. She was taken. I didn't know it at the time, but she was killed by one of them, one of the outsiders. They tore her apart, Jason, and I had to watch. I had to live with it. I thought I was saving lives, but I wasn't. I was just one man trying to fight a war that no one knew was even happening." Jason felt the blood drain from his face. "That's why you hunt them." Harold nodded solemnly. "Yes, it became my purpose, Jason, to protect others from what happened to Rebecca. And that's why I'm telling you all this, because you need to understand. You need to know what's really out there, and when the time comes, you'll need to choose whether to help me or to walk away. But you can't unsee what you've seen. I can't unsee it." Jason sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. This wasn't just some family secret, it was a nightmare. And his grandfather, the man he had always trusted, had been living in the shadows, fighting a battle against things that shouldn't exist. "Grandpa," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be a part of this." Harold's gaze softened, and for a moment he seemed almost human again, just a man who had been broken by his own war. "You don't have to decide now, Jason, but I hope you'll help me. I hope you'll be strong enough to face what's coming." Jason didn't know what to say. His world had just been turned upside down. His grandfather, a man he had once admired, was now a stranger. And the creatures Harold had spoken, the things that had been lurking in the shadows, were real. For the first time in his life, Jason realized that he wasn't just caught in the middle of a family crisis. He was standing at the edge of something much bigger, something much darker. And whether he liked it or not, his life would never be the same again. Jason stood in the dimly lit kitchen, his eyes fixed on his grandfather, Harold, whose words lingered in the air like a heavy fog. It was hard to comprehend, hard to make sense of the confession that had been revealed to him only hours ago. But despite the confusion and the sense of dread that had taken root in his chest, something deep within him stirred, something darker, something that pulled him toward the unsettling path his grandfather had walked for so many years. "You can't unsee it, Jason," Harold had said, his voice filled with a sorrow that Jason couldn't fully grasp. "You're part of this now, whether you like it or not." The idea had rattled him at first, a violent wave of disbelief crashing against him as he tried to process the revelation. But there was no denying the truth of what Harold had said. He had seen it, the body, the woman dragged through the woods like a lifeless doll, and he couldn't pretend he hadn't. It had burned itself into his mind, a vivid image that played on repeat, tormenting him as the hours passed. Jason was no longer a bystander in his own life. He was an unwilling participant in a nightmare that he hadn't chosen. The night air outside seemed to thicken, the familiar sound of the house settling adding to the weight of the conversation they'd had. It was clear to Jason now. He could walk away from his grandfather, ignore the warning signs, and live the rest of his life in ignorance. Or he could follow this path, join the fight, and confront whatever dark force was lurking in the shadows. "I'll help you," Jason finally said, his voice low, steady. The words left his lips like a reluctant promise, yet something in him knew that the decision had already been made. He wasn't sure why, wasn't sure what had convinced him, but deep down he felt the pull, a call he couldn't resist. Harold looked at him for a long moment, his face a mask of both gratitude and pain. You don't have to, Jason. This life, it's not a life anyone should choose. It's dangerous. It'll change you in ways you can't undo. I know, Jason replied, feeling the weight of his words, but also a sense of resolve growing within him. But I have to do something. I can't just sit here. Harold nodded, a grim understanding passing between them. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking with the effort as though age had started to catch up with him. He reached into the drawer beside the sink and pulled out a set of maps, yellowed, frayed at the edges, marked with the kind of detail that only someone who had been tracking monsters for decades would understand. Jason took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest as his grandfather unfolded the maps on the table. It was as though the very act of spreading them out made the enormity of the task before him even clearer. Each map was marked with symbols, strange notations, and coordinates that meant nothing to Jason at first glance. But as Harold began to explain, the pieces slowly began to fit together. These are the locations, Harold began, his voice somber. Places where the outsiders have been spotted or where their influence has been felt. I've hunted them for years, but there's always more, Jason. They don't stop, and neither can we. Jason's mind raced. What had he gotten himself into? But even as the fear tightened around his chest, he knew there was no turning back. He wasn't just helping his grandfather anymore. He was stepping into a world that was as horrifying as it was dangerous, a world where monsters were real and people like his grandfather were the only ones who could stop them. For the first time, Jason saw the true weight of his grandfather's burden. Harold wasn't just some weary old man telling tall tales of things that went bump in the night. He had been in the trenches, fighting creatures that defied human understanding. And now it was Jason's turn to join the war. Harold continued, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was about to say. We hunt them at night, Jason. They move in the dark, taking advantage of the shadows. They're like parasites, feeding off our world until there's nothing left. We've got to stop them before they spread. Jason didn't speak. He simply nodded, the weight of Harold's words sinking in like an anchor. He didn't know what was ahead, but he knew that this was no longer just a mission, it was a necessity. The days passed quickly. Jason helped Harold prepare. They spent hours poring over the maps, tracking the movements of these creatures, analyzing the clues that had been left behind. The work was grueling, relentless, and often terrifying. But with every passing hour, Jason felt something shift within him. He was no longer the boy who had arrived at his grandfather's house seeking solace. He was becoming something else, something hardened, something determined. On the night of their first hunt, Jason was nearly sick with fear. The air outside was thick with fog, and the moon barely pierced through the dense clouds above. They were deep in the woods now, just outside New Orleans, where the trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The ground was wet beneath their feet, the mud clinging to Jason's boots as they moved deeper into the forest. His pulse thrummed in his ears, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Harold led the way, his eyes sharp and focused, his movements purposeful. He didn't say much as they moved through the woods, but Jason could sense the change in him. His grandfather was no longer just an old man. He was a predator, a man who had honed his instincts over years of hunting creatures that defied logic and reason. "We'll move quietly," Harold whispered as they came to a clearing. "The outsiders can sense us, Jason. If we're not careful, they'll know we're here before we even see them." Jason nodded, trying to steady his breathing, but it felt impossible. His heart was racing, and every crack of a twig beneath his feet felt like a roar in the silence of the night. He glanced at his grandfather, who was scanning the area with a level of intensity Jason couldn't match. Harold was right. Every instinct in his body told him that they were being watched, that something was out there, waiting, lurking in the dark. And then it came. A low, guttural sound like a growl broke the silence of the night. Jason's stomach dropped. His eyes darted around the clearing, but he saw nothing. He could feel it, feel the presence of something just beyond the shadows, something that didn't belong. Harold moved first, pulling Jason behind a thick tree, his hand firm on his grandson's arm. "Stay quiet. Don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice steady. Jason's breath was coming in shallow gasps now. His entire body felt like it was on edge, like he could feel every beat of his heart in his throat. But he stayed silent, his eyes scanning the dark, searching for any sign of movement. And then he saw it just for a moment. A flicker in the shadows, something shifting just outside the light of the moon. It was quick, too quick for his eyes to fully process, but there was no mistaking what he had seen. The outsider was there. It was human, or at least it had been. Its limbs were twisted, elongated, and its face was hidden behind a mask of shadows. But the most disturbing thing about it, what made Jason's blood run cold, was the way it moved. It wasn't walking. It was crawling, dragging itself across the forest floor with a speed and grace that made Jason's stomach churn. It was like something that had been born from nightmare itself. Harold didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife, long, jagged, and gleaming in the moonlight. "We don't kill them unless we have to," he muttered. "But if it comes down to it, we finish it." Jason nodded, though his mind was reeling. He had never been this close to a monster before, not like this. The fear that had been simmering in his chest now surged to the forefront of his mind, but he swallowed it down. His grandfather was counting on him, and there was no turning back now. They moved together, silent as the grave, inching closer to the creature. Jason could hear the creature's breath, slow, labored, almost like a wheeze. He could feel its presence, a dark force that pressed in on him, making the air feel thick and oppressive. When the creature finally noticed them, it moved with a suddenness that caught Jason off guard. Its head whipped toward them, and for a moment Jason thought he saw its eyes, yellow, glimmering like burning coal, staring directly at him. It let out a high-pitched screech, and with an unnatural speed it lunged. Jason's heart stopped. In that instant, everything became a blur, a whirl of motion, a flash of light and sound. He didn't know what happened next. All he could hear was the sound of his grandfather's voice, low and commanding, telling him to move, to run, to fight. And then the world seemed to shatter. Jason's first taste of the hunt was violent, raw, and terrifying. He fought alongside his grandfather, pushing back the darkness that threatened to overtake them. The adrenaline surged through him like wildfire, and for the first time he felt the cold embrace of fear and exhilaration mix in his veins. And when it was over, when the outsider lay motionless on the ground, Jason couldn't quite believe it. He had done it. He had hunted, and he had survived. But as the adrenaline faded and the moon rose high above them, Jason knew this was just the beginning. The creatures were out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike, and it was up to him and Harold to stop them. Jason had become a part of the hunt now, and there was no going back. The hunt had begun, and with each passing day, Jason's world shrank further into the depths of an ancient war, a war against creatures that should not exist. What had once seemed like a nightmare, a tale spun by his grandfather in the quiet of their old home, was now Jason's reality. The creatures, these outsiders, were no longer mere stories or figments of his imagination. They were real, vicious, intelligent, and capable of changing shape, leaving nothing but chaos and death in their wake. And now, Jason was a part of this hunt, standing alongside his grandfather in a battle that no one else in the world knew was happening. Jason had never understood fear the way he did now. He had been afraid of the dark as a child, of shadows that seemed to move just outside his reach. But that fear was nothing compared to the primal terror that coursed through him as he stood side by side with Harold, looking into the abyss of an unknown world. The dark was no longer just a physical thing. It was a presence, a living, breathing entity that pressed against him, filled his lungs with the suffocating air of dread. The first few hunts had been a blur, a series of frenzied moments, a rush of adrenaline and the brutal, violent encounters with beings that should not be. They were too fast to track, too quick to anticipate. Jason had learned quickly that the creatures could transform, shift in ways that defied logic. A man could become a monstrous thing in the blink of an eye, their eyes turning black, their faces contorting into something inhuman. But it wasn't just their appearance that made them dangerous. It was the sheer power they wielded. These were not creatures born of nature. They were parasites, predators that existed only to consume and destroy. Harold had told him that the more they killed, the more they hunted, the more the creatures would adapt. The war would never end, not until one side was completely wiped out. And Jason knew now with a sick certainty that it was either them or the creatures. One evening, as they moved deeper into the woods just outside New Orleans, Jason felt the air shift. It was subtle at first, a faint crackle of electricity in the atmosphere, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His grandfather, as always, was ahead of him, leading the way with a calm, calculated pace. Harold didn't speak much during their hunts anymore, not since that first night when he had explained the stakes. He moved with a quiet intensity that Jason couldn't fully understand, his eyes scanning the trees, the earth, the shadows for any sign of movement. Jason's thoughts were still clouded with the images from their previous hunts, the grotesque transformations, the blood, the terror. But he had learned to push that fear aside. Fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. They had a job to do. And tonight, Jason felt it, felt the presence of something far more dangerous, more ancient than anything they had faced before. It wasn't long before they found it. The creature was unlike any Jason had seen. It moved silently through the underbrush, its body slithering like a serpent, but it had the shape of a man, or at least it had once. Its limbs were unnaturally long, bending at odd angles, its body covered in scales that gleamed in the pale moonlight. But what caught Jason's attention the most were its eyes. Bright, almost fluorescent, burning with an intelligence that sent a chill down his spine. They locked onto Jason, and for a moment he felt as though it was looking straight through him, reading his thoughts, knowing his every fear. Harold had taught him to hold his breath in these moments, to still his body, to move as silently as possible. But Jason's body refused to obey. His heart pounded in his chest, so loud he was sure the creature could hear it. It moved closer, its eyes never leaving Jason's face, as if savoring his fear, feeding off it. The air around them seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening, stretching out like dark hands reaching for them. It wasn't until the creature was nearly upon them that Harold acted. Without a word, he drew a long, curved blade from his side and lunged forward, his movements swift and precise. The creature hissed, a sound that was more like the screech of a predator than anything human, and it leapt to the side, narrowly avoiding Harold's strike. Jason's breath hitched in his throat. The creature was faster than he could have imagined, far more agile than anything human. It darted into the underbrush, its body moving with unnatural grace, and for a moment Jason thought it had disappeared completely. But Harold was already moving, his eyes locked on the creature, calculating its next move. "Stay close," Harold whispered urgently. "It knows we're here." Jason swallowed hard, his pulse racing. He tried to steady his hands, but they were shaking. He had no idea how his grandfather did it, how he could remain so calm in the face of such terror. Jason could feel the weight of the knife in his hand, the cold steel, but it felt like nothing in comparison to the power that the creature had, the overwhelming presence of evil that filled the air. They continued to move deeper into the woods, the creature always just a few steps ahead. Jason could hear it moving, rustling, snapping branches, its movements almost mocking them. It knew they were hunting it, and it was toying with them. Suddenly, the creature stopped. Jason froze, his breath caught in his chest. It was standing on all fours now, like a twisted hybrid between man and animal, its body coiling like a serpent ready to strike. It hissed again, louder this time, its voice a low, guttural sound that made Jason's skin crawl. Without warning, the creature lunged. The battle that followed was brutal, a blur of movement, flashing steel, and the deafening sound of claws raking across flesh. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he swung his blade, but the creature was too fast. Its claws slashed across his arm, sending a searing pain through his body, but Jason didn't flinch. He had to fight, had to push through the pain. This was no time for hesitation. Harold moved beside him, his knife flashing through the air, striking the creature with terrifying precision. But even with the force of Harold's blows, the creature didn't fall. It writhed and hissed, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth that glinted in the moonlight. It was as if no matter how hard they fought, it couldn't be stopped. The creature hissed again, its eyes glowing brighter, and suddenly Jason understood. It wasn't just hunting them. It was feeding on them, on their fear, on the fear that was starting to overwhelm him. With a scream of fury, Harold lunged forward, driving his knife deep into the creature's chest. The creature let out a horrible screech, its body convulsing as it fell to the ground, its life slowly draining away. Jason stood there, panting, his body trembling, his heart still racing. The air around him felt thick with the remnants of the fight, the smell of blood mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. He looked down at his hands, which were slick with sweat and blood, and realized just how close they had come to losing. "Get yourself together," Harold snapped, his voice sharp. "We're not done yet." Jason looked up to see his grandfather's face, grim and focused. For a moment, Jason wondered if his grandfather even understood fear anymore, if he had become so numb to it that it no longer affected him. But then he saw the faintest tremor in Harold's hands, and he realized that the man had lived through horrors Jason couldn't even begin to imagine. "We move on," Harold said, wiping his blade clean and returning it to its sheath. "The fight's never over. You need to learn that. You need to understand what we're up against." Jason nodded silently, the weight of Harold's words sinking into him. This was their life now, A life lived in the shadows, hunting things that were not human, not even close to human, and it wasn't going to end. The creature they had just faced was one of many, and the world was full of them, creatures that could shift between human and beast, beings that had no place in the natural world and yet were there, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. They were the predators, and Jason and Harold were the hunters. Jason's grip tightened around his knife, and though his body was battered, though his mind screamed for rest, he felt something else stirring inside him, a sense of purpose. This was his new reality. This was the beginning of the fight for survival, and as long as he drew breath, he would fight. Jason had seen the darkness in his grandfather's eyes. He had felt the cold touch of something unexplainable, something that should never have been, in the air around them. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the truth was clear now. There was no escape from it, not anymore. Harold's words echoed in Jason's mind, each sentence weighing heavier than the last. "They're not human," Harold had said, his voice a rasp of both sorrow and grim acceptance. "These creatures, these outsiders, they look like us, feel like us, but they're not us. They come from somewhere else, a place we can't even begin to understand. And once they take over someone, there's no saving them. Only one way to stop them." Jason stood in the darkened room of the house, his mind a war zone of confusion and disbelief. He wanted to scream, to ask his grandfather how this could be possible, how the world had turned into something so unrecognizable, so terrifying. But no words came. He only stood frozen in the silence, his breath shallow as he tried to process the words that had come from Harold's lips, the same lips that had once whispered comforting stories to him as a child. Jason's gaze drifted to the window, the moonlight filtering through the trees outside, casting long, crooked shadows across the floor. His mind was too clouded with what he had just learned, the confession that had torn apart every sense of reality he had clung to. His grandfather, the man who had once been a pillar of strength, a steady figure in his life, had been killing people. But not out of hatred, not out of revenge. No, Harold had been hunting to protect the world from a much greater evil, an evil that Jason had now become a part of. The Outsiders. Jason shuddered at the name. It wasn't just a title, it was a curse, a nightmare that was coming true. These creatures, these beings from another world, had found their way into human society, worming their way into the bodies of unsuspecting victims. They wore the faces of people Jason might have known, neighbors, colleagues, loved ones, and yet they were something else entirely. He had seen them in the woods, their twisted forms and their unnatural speed, their hunger for destruction. But what Jason didn't understand, what he was struggling to comprehend, was how his grandfather, the man who had cared for him, who had been a doctor, a healer, had become the one responsible for stopping them. Harold had admitted that he had killed before. He had killed in the name of survival, but the revelation came as a gut-wrenching blow. Those people he had killed, they weren't innocent. They were already gone, replaced by something monstrous. And worse, some of them had once been human. Some of them had once been victims of the outsiders, their bodies hijacked, their minds no longer their own. Jason's stomach churned as the truth began to sink in. It was not revenge that had driven his grandfather to kill. It was necessity, and the need to protect the very people he loved. But as much as Harold had explained, as much as Jason had tried to understand, one thing remained clear. The fight was far from over. Jason couldn't shake the image of the woman from the night before, the one he had seen dragged into the woods, lifeless and cold, her body a vessel for something else. A monster. He saw her face now, the memory flashing in his mind like a cruel ghost. She had been a person once, someone with a life, a family, and now she was gone, replaced by something terrifying. Jason had never known a true monster until that moment. Now he was learning what it meant to face them head-on. As the days passed, Jason's relationship with his grandfather grew strained. There were moments when Harold was distant, his eyes clouded with something Jason couldn't quite place. Other times, his grandfather would slip into moments of quiet reflection, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he went through the maps, marking off locations where outsiders had been spotted. Jason was no longer the wide-eyed boy who had trusted his grandfather's every word. He had seen too much. He had felt the weight of the truth crashing down on him. And now he knew that his life would never be the same again. One night, as they sat in the study, poring over the old maps and notes Harold had kept hidden for so many years, Jason couldn't keep the questions at bay any longer. "How did you know?" Jason asked, his voice breaking the silence. "How did you know who was taken? How could you tell the difference between a normal person and one of them?" Harold sat back in his chair, his tired eyes meeting Jason's with a look of understanding, as though he had known this question was coming. "I didn't always know, Jason. At first, it was just a gut feeling, a sense that something wasn't right. People would change, act differently, lose themselves in ways that didn't make sense. But it wasn't until your grandmother, Rebecca, that I knew for sure. I had always suspected something was wrong with the world, something hidden beneath the surface. But when she was taken, I saw it for myself. I knew that what we were facing was something that couldn't be ignored. I had to do something, Jason. I couldn't let it spread." Jason swallowed hard, his throat tight. "But how did you kill them? How did you know they weren't human anymore?" Harold's eyes softened, his voice low and full of sorrow. "It's not easy, Jason. I'm not proud of it. But there's a point when you realize that there's no other choice. The outsiders, they don't die like we do. They don't bleed not the way we do. But they feel pain just like us. They can be destroyed. It's not clean, it's not right, but it's necessary." Jason sat there, silent, the weight of his grandfather's confession pressing down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for Harold, killing people who had once been human, people who had once been someone's family. But what choice did he have? What other option was there when the alternative was allowing these creatures to spread, to take over, to destroy everything? Jason leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. There were too many questions left unanswered, too many things he didn't understand. The outside world seemed so far away now, so irrelevant. All he could see was the path ahead, a path that would lead him deeper into a world of monsters, a world where the line between the human and the monstrous was blurred beyond recognition. Harold had spent his life fighting this war in the shadows, away from the prying eyes of the world. But Jason now understood that there was no escaping it. The war was real, and it was coming for them, for everyone. "Grandpa," Jason said quietly, his voice steady but filled with something he hadn't expected, determination. "We need to end this. We can't keep hiding. We have to stop them." Harold's eyes met his, a flicker of pride and sadness mixing in them. "We do what we can, Jason, but it's never enough. It never ends. The outsiders, they're always out there, always watching. But we fight anyway, because if we don't, who will?" Jason didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, his body trembling with adrenaline, fear, and something else. Something that was growing inside him, something that pushed him forward. The truth was clear now. There was no going back. He had to face what lay ahead. And as he stepped into the dark unknown with his grandfather by his side, Jason knew that this was the beginning of something far worse than anything he could have imagined. The war had just begun, and Jason was going to fight. The air was thick with the stench of decay and anticipation as Jason and his grandfather, Harold, moved deeper into the woods, their steps calculated, careful. The moon hung high above them, casting a pale, sickly light on the twisted shapes of the trees that surrounded them. The forest seemed to breathe with them, as though the earth itself was alive with secrets. Secrets Jason wasn't ready to face, but knew he had no choice but to confront. The hunt had grown more dangerous over the past weeks. What had once been a scattered effort, hunting isolated outsiders here and there, had quickly evolved into something far more insidious. It was no longer just the occasional creature lurking in the shadows. Something had changed, something deeper, something darker. The outsiders had organized, and now they were hunting in packs. "Do you feel it, Jason?" Harold's voice cut through the stillness, low and tense, carrying a weight Jason had never heard before. Jason nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest and his breath came in shallow gasps. "They're closer now, more of them." "Yes," Harold murmured, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area around them. "They've been moving in groups for weeks. And tonight we confront them. They're starting to pick off the innocent. They're not hiding anymore." Jason clenched his fists, the tension in his shoulders unbearable. He had heard whispers of the outsiders' increasing numbers, the reports of strange disappearances, but this was the moment when it became real. The world he had known, the one he had once trusted, was unraveling before him, and Jason was now an unwilling participant in a war against creatures that could bend reality to their will. "We need to act fast," Jason said, his voice steady despite the rising terror in his gut. "We can't let them reach the city." Harold gave a grim nod. "They've already been there. The outsiders have infiltrated places we once thought safe. Tonight, we stop them once and for all." As they made their way deeper into the forest, Jason couldn't help but feel the oppressive weight of fear pressing against him. Every branch that snapped underfoot, every gust of wind that whistled through the trees, seemed to hold the potential for disaster. Every step they took drew them closer to something Jason knew would test him in ways he couldn't anticipate. And yet there was no turning back now. He had been pulled into this nightmare, and there was only one way out. Harold paused, his hand raised, signaling for Jason to stop. They had reached the edge of a clearing, a place where the dense trees broke into an open space, bathed in the sickly light of the moon. The ground here was damp, the air thick with the sound of distant movement. Jason's eyes narrowed as he scanned the area, his senses heightened. The clearing was eerily silent, the stillness hanging heavy between them. Then a sound, a low growl barely audible but unmistakable. Jason's heart skipped a beat as the sound grew louder, followed by the rustling of leaves, the shifting of something large and predatory in the shadows. "They're here," Harold whispered, his voice tense with a quiet fury. "Get ready." Before Jason could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, an outsider. It was humanoid, but its features were grotesque, twisted. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, predatory. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, serrated teeth, and as it hissed, a wave of disgust and fear washed over Jason. But this wasn't the only one. From the darkness of the trees more emerged. 5, 6, no, 7 of them, each more terrifying than the last. Their bodies shifted and writhed, their forms constantly changing, as if they couldn't decide what they wanted to be. A woman with long, flowing hair one moment, a jagged, monstrous figure the next. A man with hollow eyes, his body elongating and contracting like a serpent. The others followed, their faces half-formed, grotesque, and deadly. Jason's hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, the cold steel offering a brief moment of comfort. But as he looked around at the creatures surrounding them, his heart sank. They were outnumbered. "Don't let them surround you," Harold whispered sharply. "We fight, but we don't stop running until we've killed as many as we can." Jason's muscles tensed. He wanted to hesitate, to second-guess the decision, but he couldn't. His grandfather was right. They were already too deep in this nightmare, and if they didn't kill these creatures now, they would spread like a disease and the world would never be the same. Harold lunged first. The blade he carried was an extension of him, swift and efficient, slicing through the air with deadly precision. The nearest outsider, a twisted form of a man with hunched shoulders and long, clawed fingers, lunged at him, but Harold was faster. He buried the knife deep in the creature's chest, twisting it with a brutal motion that silenced the creature's screech. Jason followed Harold's lead, charging at the nearest outsider. The creature hissed at him, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of teeth. Jason slashed with his knife, but the outsider was faster. It ducked under his blow, its claws sweeping across his side, the impact of the strike sending a searing pain through his body. Jason gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain, and swung again, this time driving the blade into the creature's throat. The outsider howled in pain, but it didn't fall. It writhed and twisted, trying to escape Jason's grip, but Jason held firm, his mind blank, focused only on survival. He twisted the knife again, and with a sickening gurgle, the creature collapsed, its body twitching for a moment before going still. Jason stood over the creature's body, panting, his heart pounding in his chest. His body was trembling with the rush of adrenaline, the shock of the kill still settling in his veins. But there was no time to think about it. He could feel the others moving in, their unnatural speed overwhelming, their presence suffocating. Harold was already engaged with another outsider, his knife moving in rapid, precise movements, each strike aimed at the heart. The creature, a grotesque mockery of a woman with elongated arms and legs, hissed as Harold's blade sank into its side. It screeched and swiped at him with claws that could tear through steel. But Harold was relentless. With a final, deadly strike, he drove the blade through the creature's skull, the sickening crack of bone echoing through the clearing. But the battle was far from over. The remaining outsiders circled around them, faster now, more desperate. Jason felt the weight of his fear grow heavier with each moment, his body moving on instinct, each swing of his knife sharper than the last. The creatures were relentless, but so were they. The fight seemed endless, the clearing becoming a battlefield of blood and bodies. Jason's vision blurred, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally, but there was no room for weakness. He couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. The creatures had to be stopped. They had to be wiped out or the world would burn. The fight dragged on, and Jason could feel it, could feel himself changing, adapting to the violence, to the brutality of the world his grandfather had prepared him for. It was as if the very air around him was thick with blood, with the screams of the dying, and Jason had to push through it all to survive, to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last outsider fell. Jason stood over the creature's body, his body trembling with exhaustion and disbelief. The clearing around him was silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of himself and his grandfather. The creatures were gone, but Jason knew this was just one battle in a war that would never end. He turned to Harold, his eyes filled with something new, something raw, something hard. "We did it," Jason said, his voice hoarse yet filled with resolve. Harold's eyes met his, and for the first time in a long while Jason saw a flicker of pride in his grandfather's eyes. "We did," Harold said softly. "But the war isn't over, Jason, and you've just taken your first step into the darkness. There's no going back." Jason nodded, his mind already focused on what lay ahead. He had come to understand the cost of this fight, the sacrifices that would be required of him. But he also knew one thing for certain: no matter how many times he faced the darkness, he would keep fighting. For his grandfather, for the world, for himself. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over, and Jason was ready to face whatever came next. The truth had always been elusive, like a shadow that danced just beyond the edges of Jason's vision. He had seen it, the horrors, the creatures, the relentless fight against something that no one else knew existed. But even as the hunt had grown fiercer, as the nights had turned colder, and the stakes had become deadlier, Jason hadn't anticipated the revelation that would rock him to his core. It wasn't just the creatures that had begun to change him. It wasn't just the bloodshed, the constant battle against monsters that threatened humanity. Something else was happening, something far more insidious. The connection between Jason and the outsiders was no longer just a vague suspicion. It was becoming a reality, a horrifying truth that was written in his very flesh. Jason's body had begun to betray him. At first, it was subtle, a feeling of strength that hadn't been there before, an unusual sharpness in his senses. He could feel the muscles in his arms growing tighter, his reflexes quicker, more precise. His vision sharpened in the dark, the shadows no longer an obstacle but a playground, a place where he could move as fluidly as the creatures he hunted. He could hear things he hadn't been able to before, the sound of a heartbeat miles away, the rustle of wind through the trees, as if the world itself had spoken to him in a language only he could understand. It was intoxicating. Powerful. It felt like an awakening, like he was becoming something greater. And yet, there was something lurking beneath it all, something that made Jason feel like he was slipping into a darkness he couldn't escape. With each passing day, the strength that coursed through him felt more alien, more unnatural. His body, once his own, was changing in ways he couldn't control. And with those changes came whispers, silent, maddening whispers that spoke to him when he was alone, that seemed to pull at his very thoughts. Jason had always been in control of his body, his mind. But now it felt as though someone or something else was tugging at the edges of his consciousness, urging him to give in, to become one with the dark. He could feel the temptation like a poison, seeping into his veins, whispering promises of power, of strength, of dominance over the creatures he fought. But Jason knew better than to trust that voice. He had seen what these creatures could do, how they could invade, possess, and consume. And as much as the power within him felt like an answer, he knew that the cost was far too high. It was a slow, creeping realization, but one he couldn't deny. He was becoming one of them. He tried to shake the thought, to push it away, but it clung to him like a shadow. He looked into the mirror one morning and saw the changes, the subtle shifts that marked him. His eyes were sharper now, more intense, almost glowing. His skin had taken on a slightly unnatural pallor, a smoothness that made him look like he was no longer fully human. And his reflection, it wasn't quite right. There was something in his gaze, something cold and calculating that hadn't been there before. But it wasn't just the changes in his appearance that frightened him. It was the feeling that had started to overtake him, the deep sense that he was no longer in control. He didn't know how long he had been hiding it from his grandfather. It had been weeks now since the first changes had started to manifest, and every day brought a new sensation, a new fear. His body had grown stronger, faster, and more attuned to the fight. But with that strength came a darkness, a gnawing sensation in the pit of his stomach that told him he was not just hunting these creatures. He was becoming one of them. It was Harold who finally noticed it, though Jason had suspected his grandfather already knew. It was one of those rare moments when they sat together in the study, poring over the maps and notes, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Harold's eyes never left Jason as he spoke, his voice low, his words carrying the weight of something ancient, something that had been hidden for far too long. "You feel it, don't you?" Harold asked, his voice tinged with something Jason couldn't quite place. Fear, guilt, the changes, the strength, the power. Jason froze, his fingers tightening around the map in front of him. The words were like a hammer to his chest. He wanted to deny it, to dismiss it as paranoia, but deep down he knew it was true. "I don't know what's happening to me, Grandpa," Jason whispered, his voice shaking. "I feel different, stronger, but wrong." Harold sighed deeply, as if he had been waiting for this moment for far longer than Jason had realized. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes hard, but with a sorrow that Jason couldn't shake. "There's something I need to tell you, Jason," Harold said, his voice strained as though the words themselves were a burden he had carried for too long. "It's the seed." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Seed? What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Harold's eyes darkened, his face twisting with the weight of his revelation. "It's a part of them, Jason, a part of the outsiders. When they invade, they don't just take over, they plant something. A seed, a fragment of their being deep inside their host. It's how they control them, how they make them one of them." Jason's blood ran cold. "You're saying that Harold's gaze never wavered. "When you were a child, before I ever realized what was happening, I think one of them got to you. I think one of those outsiders planted their seed inside you." Jason's breath caught in his throat, his body going numb with disbelief. "No, no, that's not possible. I was just a kid. How could you let this happen to me?" Harold's face grew even more sorrowful and his voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't know, Jason. I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. By the time I figured it out, the seed had already taken root. It was inside you, growing, changing you. I tried to keep it hidden, to keep you safe, but now I see it for myself. The power, the strength, it's them, it's their influence, it's what's driving you now." Jason stumbled back, his heart racing, his body filled with an icy fear that froze him in place. "So I'm becoming one of them." He looked up at his grandfather, his voice trembling. "How do I stop it? How do I get rid of it?" Harold shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with regret. "You can't stop it, Jason. The seed has taken root. The changes you're feeling, they're just the beginning. You're becoming something else, something that is no longer human. It's already in you, and it will never let go." Jason's mind spun with horror and disbelief. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body felt heavy, like it was betraying him, like it was no longer his to command. The strength he had felt, the power that had surged through him, it had been there doing all along. He had become an unwitting vessel for the outsider's seed, and now he was nothing more than a pawn in a war he had never asked to fight. "Grandpa," Jason's voice cracked, his throat tight with fear. "What do I do now?" Harold's face softened, his voice a quiet, almost broken murmur. "I don't know, Jason, but I'll help you. I've always tried to protect you. I've kept you safe from them, from the truth. But now we face the darkness together." Jason stood there, his world collapsing around him. He had thought he was fighting for survival, for the safety of those who couldn't defend themselves. But now he realized that the enemy wasn't just the outsiders. The enemy was within him. His body had become the battleground, the line between humanity and monstrosity drawn inside his very flesh. He was fighting something darker than he had ever imagined. And the question that haunted him now was simple. Could he survive the war within himself? The seed had been planted long ago, but Jason wasn't sure if he could stop it from growing. And as he looked into his grandfather's eyes, he knew that this war was far from over. This was just the beginning. The real fight had just begun. Jason's world had been consumed by darkness. The life he had once known, normal, simple, safe, was a distant memory, a fragile illusion that had shattered the moment he stepped into his grandfather's world. A world filled with monsters, with creatures that tore through the fabric of reality itself. And now, as he stood on the precipice of an unknown future, Jason knew that his fate had already been sealed in ways he could never have imagined. The seed had taken root within him, a parasite that had quietly thrived for years in the hidden corners of his being. The moment Harold had spoken those words, the terrifying truth had crashed into Jason's mind like a wave, pulling him under. He was no longer just fighting the outsiders, those creatures from a world beyond comprehension. He was fighting against himself, against the very thing inside him that threatened to strip away his humanity, to turn him into one of them. Jason could feel it in his bones, in the blood that coursed through his veins. There were moments when the power inside him surged with such intensity that it almost overwhelmed him, making him feel invincible, like he could take on the world and win. But there were darker moments too, moments when the whispers came, the whispers that called to him, urging him to give in, to let go of the human part of himself and embrace the strength, the power, the endless hunger that came with the outsider's influence. He could feel the seed growing, shifting, molding him into something else, something that could never be undone. But there was no time to dwell on what had been or what was still to come. The battle was still here. The creatures, the outsiders, were out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next chance to strike. And if Jason didn't stop them, no one else would. His grandfather had spent his life hunting them, sacrificing everything to protect the world from their twisted reign. Now, it was Jason's turn. Jason stood in front of the mirror in the small, dimly lit room of their house, staring at his reflection. His once familiar face was now a stranger's, a face that held the echoes of something darker, something he didn't fully recognize. His eyes glowed faintly, as if a fire burned just beneath the surface of his pupils, and his skin, once pale and human, now had a faint, almost unnatural sheen. The changes were subtle, but they were there, creeping into every part of him like a shadow that refused to be shaken. He had to stop it. He had to stop himself from becoming something he feared. The pain was unbearable at times, physical and mental. It was as though his very essence was being stretched thin, pulled in two directions, the man he had been and the thing he was becoming. Jason could hear the whispers again, low and insistent, crawling through his mind like a disease. They spoke of power, of freedom, of shedding the weakness of the human form. They promised him control, control over his enemies, control over the world that had betrayed him. But Jason knew the price of that control. He had seen what happened to those who gave in, who let the outsiders take root. He had seen the twisted remains of those who had been consumed by the creatures, their bodies and minds corrupted beyond recognition. If he let the seed inside him grow, if he gave in, there would be no turning back. He would become one of them, and the world would be lost. Jason's hand tightened around the knife at his side, the cool steel a reminder of the battle ahead. His grandfather had armed him with knowledge, with weapons, and with a grim understanding of the cost of this fight. But no amount of preparation could ready him for the truth he had just learned. The outsider seed was inside him, and it would never stop fighting for control. The world outside was quiet, the streets of New Orleans bathed in the unnatural silence that seemed to precede something terrible. Jason knew that the creatures had grown bolder, more aggressive. They had been picking off the weak, blending in with the humans, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now they were close, too close. Jason's heart beat loudly in his chest as he walked through the house, gathering his things. He was no longer just his grandfather's apprentice. He was the protector now, the last line of defense against the horrors that lurked just out of sight. But even as the responsibility weighed heavily on him, Jason knew he couldn't do it alone. Harold was waiting for him outside, his face etched with a weariness that spoke of years of endless fighting. He had seen it all, fought it all, and yet the burden was never lighter. Jason could see the concern in his grandfather's eyes, the unspoken fear that Jason might not be able to control the darkness inside him, the same darkness that had claimed so many before him. "Are you ready?" Harold asked, his voice low, serious. Jason looked up at him, feeling the weight of the question. He wasn't ready, not in any traditional sense. No one was ever ready to face the horrors they had seen, the creatures that existed outside of human understanding. But there was no other choice. There was no time to hesitate. "I'm ready," Jason said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly. Harold nodded, but Jason saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "The outsiders are hunting in packs now. They're becoming smarter, more organized. They're getting closer, Jason, and we have to stop them before they take anyone else." Jason's grip on the knife tightened, his body thrumming with a newfound energy. "We will." Harold led the way as they made their way through the streets of New Orleans, moving with the precision of two hunters who had done this too many times to count. The night felt oppressive, like a storm waiting to break, and Jason's senses were heightened to the point of discomfort. He could feel the creatures lurking just beyond the light, their presence crawling across his skin like insects. They had been following the tracks of the outsiders for days now, closing in on their hideout. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the final push, the last chance to stop them from taking over. Jason didn't speak as they made their way into the alleyways, the damp air heavy with the smell of decay. He could hear Harold's steady breathing beside him, the soft scrape of boots against wet pavement. It was as if the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. And then they found it. The hideout was hidden beneath an abandoned building, a place where the outsiders had made their nest. The entrance was a small, unmarked door at the back, barely visible in the dim light. Jason's pulse quickened as they approached, the sound of his heartbeat drowning out everything else. The door creaked as Harold pushed it open, revealing a dark, narrow stairwell that led down into the depths of the building. Jason felt the familiar, suffocating weight of fear crawl up his spine. He had done this before, hunted the creatures in the shadows, but something about tonight felt different. Something about the way the world seemed to hold its breath, as though it too knew what was coming. The stairs creaked underfoot as they descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. Jason could feel the whispers again, the low, insistent call of the outsiders, urging him forward, taunting him with promises of power. His fingers curled around the knife in his hand, the cold steel a reminder that he was still human, still fighting. They reached the bottom and the smell hit him first, a rancid, suffocating odor that burned in the back of his throat. It was like decay, like the scent of death itself. And then he saw them, the outsiders. They were more monstrous than Jason could have ever imagined, more twisted, more grotesque. Their bodies were contorted, their limbs elongated and unnatural, and their eyes gleamed with a cold intelligence. They stood in the shadows, waiting for their prey, their presence suffocating the air around them. Jason's heart raced as the creatures moved, their grotesque forms shifting and changing. It was clear now this wasn't just a fight against monsters. This was the end of everything. Jason stepped forward, his knife raised, his mind focused. This was the moment. There would be no turning back after this. He would fight with everything he had, and if he failed, if he fell to the darkness, then the world would fall with him. "We end it now," Jason whispered, his voice filled with determination. And with that, the final battle began. The creatures lunged, their claws flashing in the dark, their teeth gleaming with malice. But Jason fought with everything in him, his mind a blur of fury and survival. The fight was brutal, a battle of blood and flesh, a war between humanity and the forces of darkness. And as the last outsider fell, its twisted body crumpling to the ground, Jason knew one thing for certain: the war was far from over. The seed within him had not been destroyed, and though the creatures had been vanquished for now, the darkness inside him would never truly go away. The battle had been won, but the fight for his humanity, his very soul, was just beginning. The journey of Jason, from an ordinary young man to an unwilling participant in a war against monstrous outsiders, is a tale of survival, transformation, and the terrifying cost of truth. What began as an exploration of family secrets, hidden monsters, and an ancient battle quickly escalated into a personal journey of self-discovery. Jason's struggle to fight the dark creatures, while simultaneously fighting the darkness growing within him, speaks to a fundamental truth about the human condition. From the moment he learned of the outsiders, those horrific, shape-shifting beings who could possess humans, taking over their bodies and minds, Jason was forced to reconcile with a reality he could no longer ignore. He was not just hunting these monsters, but was unknowingly connected to them. The seed that had been planted within him as a child, a fragment of the very creatures he was hunting, grew like a parasite, threatening to overpower him, consume him. The deeper Jason delved into this grim reality, the more he realized that the true battle wasn't just about slaying external monsters. The battle was within himself. He had to confront the growing power within, the seed that threatened to corrupt everything he was. The final confrontation, though triumphant, left Jason with a bitter understanding. The war against the outsiders would never truly end. The creatures had been defeated for now, but the seed inside him remained, a constant reminder of what he had become. Jason's journey, while physically dangerous, was ultimately a fight for his very soul, a struggle to retain his humanity in a world where the line between man and monster had blurred beyond recognition. The most powerful lesson Jason's story teaches us is about the constant struggle between our internal darkness and the light we strive to preserve. We all have battles. whether they are external forces, internal struggles, or moments when our fears and weaknesses threaten to consume us. Jason's story shows us that even in the face of terrifying truths, we must decide whether to surrender to the darkness or fight against it. Sometimes, the greatest threat is not the world around us, but the silent battles we face inside ourselves, the seeds of doubt, fear, and despair that we carry. This is a lesson we can apply in our own lives. We all have our seeds, moments of fear, loss, regret, or trauma that can silently grow inside us. We may not even recognize them at first, but if left unchecked, they can change who we are. The question is, how do we deal with these inner challenges? Do we give in to them, letting them define us? Or do we confront them, face the darkness head-on, and fight for our peace, our integrity, our humanity? Jason's journey isn't just one of horror and monsters. It's about choice. It's about the choice to fight for what's good within us, even when we're confronted with overwhelming odds. It's about facing our fears, accepting the darkness inside, and choosing to remain human despite it all. What do you think of Jason's journey? How do you relate to the struggle between facing inner darkness and embracing the light within? Have you ever faced a battle where you felt the weight of both your fears and your strengths pulling you in different directions? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below so we can all reflect on this together. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more spine-chilling tales from the world of Whispers in the Dark, don't forget to subscribe. Your support will give us the motivation to continue bringing you thrilling, thought-provoking stories that keep you on the edge of your seat.